There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead grows impossibly thin. Places where whispers carry on the wind, where shadows move against their own accord, and where the very air seems charged with the electricity of otherworldly presence. For me, Oakwood Cemetery has always been such a place. I never chose to be a spirit medium. The gift or curse, depending on your perspective, chose me. It started with whispers when I was a child, escalated to visions in my teens, and finally blossomed into full-blown communication with the dead by my early 20s. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered during my year-long investigation of Oakwood Cemetery. This book chronicles my experiences as a medium working within the confines of this historic graveyard, documenting the stories of those who linger between worlds and the truths they desperately wish to share. What began as a simple paranormal investigation evolved into something far more profound, a journey not just through the physical grounds of the cemetery, but through the very nature of death, grief, and what it truly means to be at peace. Within these pages, you'll find detailed accounts of my encounters with the spirits who call Oakwood their eternal home. From the tragic tale of a young bride buried in her wedding dress, to the mysterious groundskeeper who still tends to his duties long after his own death, each chapter reveals a new layer of the complex tapestry of stories that make up this haunted ground. But this isn't just a collection of ghost stories. It's a meditation on mortality, a reflection on the thin line between this world and the next, and an exploration of the profound connections that persist even after death. Through my experiences as a medium, I've come to understand that graveyards are not places of endings, but rather spaces where countless stories converge and continue. I must warn readers that what follows is not for the faint of heart. While I've encountered many peaceful spirits in my work, there are also darker entities that roam these grounds. I've witnessed phenomena that defy explanation, even by those of us who regularly commune with the dead. Some of the events described in these pages challenged my own understanding of what's possible in the realm of spirit communication. Throughout this book, I maintain my commitment to absolute honesty. Every encounter, every conversation with the dead, every inexplicable event is documented exactly as it occurred. I've included detailed descriptions of my methods as a medium, the protocols I follow to ensure authentic communication, and the precautions I take to protect both myself and the spirits I encounter. As you read, you may find yourself questioning your own beliefs about what happens after we die. You may wonder about the loved ones you've lost and whether they too might be trying to reach across the veil. My hope is that these accounts will not only entertain, but also provide comfort and understanding to those grappling with questions about the afterlife. Join me as I walk among the tombstones of Oakwood Cemetery, serving as a bridge between worlds. Through my experiences, you'll discover that death is not the end of the story. It's merely the beginning of a different kind of existence, one that occasionally intersects with our own in the most extraordinary ways. Welcome to my year among the spirits of Oakwood Cemetery. Their stories await. The iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery creaked shut behind me as dusk settled over the grounds. My footsteps crunched against the gravel path, the sound seemingly amplified in the growing darkness. It was October 15th, and the autumn air carried the sweet decay of fallen leaves, nature's reminder that death is simply part of life's cycle. I hadn't planned to begin my investigation that night. In fact, I had only meant to do a preliminary walkthrough of the grounds to get a feel for the layout before starting my year-long study of the cemetery's paranormal activity. But as any experienced medium will tell you, spirits rarely conform to our carefully laid plans. The first whisper came as I passed the McCarthy Mausoleum, a towering structure of weathered granite that dominated the cemetery's eastern section. It wasn't so much a voice as it was a feeling, like someone exhaling against the back of my neck. I've learned over the years to trust these subtle indicators. They're often the precursors to more dramatic manifestations. "Who's there?" I asked softly, not expecting an audible response. In my experience, spirit communication rarely works like it does in the movies. There are no disembodied voices shouting, "Get out!" or floating orbs leading the way to hidden treasures. Instead, it's more like trying to tune an old radio. Sometimes you catch clear signals, but more often, you're working through static and interference. The response came not in words, but in a sudden drop in temperature. The warm October evening turned frigid in the space of a heartbeat. My breath fogged in front of me as I reached for my equipment bag. I always carry the basics: an EMF meter, a digital voice recorder, a notebook, and various protective items: sage, blessed salt, and my grandmother's rosary. Some might call it superstitious, but when you work with the dead, you learn to take precautions. The EMF meter sparked to life as soon as I switched it on, its lights dancing in a pattern I'd never seen before. Typically, spirit energy registers as sporadic spikes, but this was different, a steady, pulsing rhythm, like a heartbeat. I fumbled with my recorder, hands shaking slightly from both the cold and anticipation. "I'm here to listen," I announced to the empty air. "I mean no disrespect to any spirits present. I'm a medium, and I've come to help share your stories if you're willing to share them." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The whispers that had been at the edge of my consciousness suddenly amplified, becoming a chorus of overlapping voices. I couldn't make out individual words, but the urgency was clear. They wanted to be heard. They needed to be heard. My training kicked in, and I focused on grounding myself. It's essential not to let spirits overwhelm you. That's how possession happens, though I've never personally encountered a case. I took deep breaths, visualizing roots extending from my feet into the earth below, anchoring me firmly in the physical world while remaining open to the spiritual. As I centered myself, one voice gradually became clearer than the others. It was a woman's voice, young but weighted with sorrow. "Emily," she whispered, the name carrying on a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the still evening air. "Find Emily." I reached for my notebook, recording the name and the time. 7:42 p.m. Experience has taught me to document everything, no matter how insignificant it might seem at the moment. Later, these details often prove crucial in piecing together the larger story. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the nearby headstones, an impossibility given the season, yet there it was. I knew I needed to pace myself. My first night wasn't the time to dive too deeply into whatever mystery was unfolding here. Sometimes the dead are too eager to share their stories all at once, and that enthusiasm can be dangerous for the living. "I hear you," I said firmly but gently. "I will help find Emily, but I need to do this carefully. I'll return tomorrow night, and we can continue our conversation then." The response was immediate. The temperature began to normalize, and the oppressive feeling of multiple presences gradually lifted. However, just as I turned to leave, I felt a light touch on my shoulder, like fingers brushing against my jacket. I spun around, but of course there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. On the ground at my feet lay a single white rose petal, fresh and unblemished. I looked around, but there were no rose bushes in sight, and it wasn't the season for roses anyway. I carefully picked up the petal and placed it in an evidence bag, another habit from years of paranormal investigation. As I walked back to the cemetery gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that this year was going to be unlike any investigation I'd done before. The spirits of Oakwood Cemetery had stories to tell, and they'd chosen me to tell them. The mystery of Emily was just the beginning. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was that first night. I thought I understood what I was getting into, thought my years of experience as a medium had prepared me for whatever I might encounter. I couldn't have been more wrong. The spirits of Oakwood Cemetery would challenge everything I thought I knew about the dead, about my abilities, and about the very nature of life and death itself. That first whisper was just the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. As I locked the cemetery gates behind me that night, I had no idea that I was about to uncover a century-old mystery, one that would put me in direct conflict with both the living and the dead. But that's the thing about working with spirits. Once they choose you to tell their story, you don't really have a choice in the matter. The story of Emily was waiting to be told, and the spirits of Oakwood Cemetery would make sure I heard every word of it, whether I was ready or not. The key to being a successful medium isn't just about having the ability to hear spirits, it's about learning to listen properly. There's a crucial difference between the two, as I would soon discover during my second night at Oakwood Cemetery. I arrived earlier the next evening, just as the sun was setting. The cemetery looked different in the dying light, less threatening perhaps, but more melancholic. The shadows stretched longer across the graves, and the old oak trees that gave the cemetery its name cast intricate patterns on the ground below. I came prepared this time, having spent the day researching the cemetery's history. Oakwood had been established in 1847, making it one of the oldest cemeteries in the region. More importantly, I had searched for any record of an Emily connected to the grounds. There were 17 Emilys buried here, according to the official records, but something told me the Emily I was looking for might not be in those records at all. As I made my way back to the McCarthy Mausoleum where I'd had my first encounter, I mentally reviewed the techniques I'd learned over years of communicating with spirits. Most mediums develop their own methods, but there are some universal principles. First and foremost, respect. The dead deserve the same courtesy as the living, perhaps even more so, given their vulnerable state. I set up my equipment with practiced efficiency: EMF meter, digital recorder, notebook, and a small battery-powered lantern. Some mediums prefer total darkness, but I've found that spirits don't really care about lighting conditions. That's just Hollywood theatrics. "I've returned as promised," I announced to the gathering darkness. "I'm here to learn more about Emily." The response was different this time. Instead of the overwhelming chorus of voices I'd experienced the night before, there was a single, clear presence. The temperature dropped again, but not as dramatically. The EMF meter showed steady activity, but nothing like the pulsing rhythm from before. Then I heard it, a humming sound, soft and melodic. It took me a moment to recognize the tune. "Beautiful Dreamer," a Stephen Foster song from the 1860s. I quickly jotted this detail in my notebook. Even the smallest details can be significant clues when working with spirits. "Can you tell me more?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle and encouraging. "Who is Emily to you?" The humming stopped abruptly, and I felt a sudden pressure in my ears, like being underwater. This is often how spirits attempt to communicate more directly, by manipulating the physical sensations of the living. It can be disorienting, but I've learned to work through it. Images began flooding my mind. A young woman in a pale blue dress, her hair done up in the style of the late 1800s, a garden full of white roses, a letter sealed with red wax, and most vividly, a locket containing a tiny painted portrait. These weren't just random visions. They were memories, impressed upon my consciousness by a spirit desperate to communicate. I described everything I was seeing out loud, recording it all on my digital recorder. Experience has taught me that these intense moments of connection don't last long, and it's easy to forget details once they pass. "The locket?" a voice whispered, clearer than any spirit voice I'd heard before. "Find the locket." "Where is it?" I asked, but I could already feel the connection weakening. The pressure in my ears was subsiding, and the vivid images were fading like morning mist in sunlight. Just then, my EMF meter began crackling with new activity. The reading was coming from a different direction, away from the mausoleum, toward a section of older graves partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery. I followed the signal, pushing carefully through the vegetation. The headstone I found was so weathered that the inscription was barely legible. I had to use my phone's flashlight and trace the letters with my fingers to make them out. Margaret Blackwood. Beloved sister, 1845-1868. In dreams we meet again. There was nothing about an Emily on the stone, but the inscription about dreams caught my attention, given the lullaby I'd heard moments before. As I knelt to examine the grave more closely, my hand brushed against something cool and metallic, partially buried in the soil beside the headstone. My heart raced as I carefully brushed away the dirt. It was a locket, tarnished almost black with age, but unmistakably similar to the one I'd seen in my vision. My hands trembled as I picked it up, wrapped it in a clean handkerchief, and placed it in my evidence bag. I didn't try to open it. Handling artifacts from graves requires careful preservation techniques, and I wanted to document everything properly. The discovery of the locket seemed to trigger a new wave of activity. The temperature plummeted again, and I heard what sounded like sobbing coming from somewhere behind me. When I turned, I caught a glimpse of something that nearly stopped my heart. A figure in a pale blue dress, standing between two oak trees about 30 feet away. But when I blinked, she was gone. I knew I should call it a night. Two major pieces of evidence, the identity of Margaret Blackwood and the discovery of the locket, were more than enough for one session. Plus, I've learned the hard way that pushing too far, too fast can be dangerous in this line of work. Spirits can become agitated if they feel rushed, and an agitated spirit can be unpredictable. As I packed up my equipment, I felt a gentle touch on my cheek, like a caress from an icy hand. The gesture wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt grateful. "I'll be back. I promised. We'll figure this out together." Walking back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just scratched the surface of something much bigger than a simple haunting. The connection between Margaret Blackwood, the mysterious Emily, and the locket was still unclear. But one thing was certain. The spirits of Oakwood Cemetery were leading me toward a story that had been waiting over a century to be told. What I didn't realize then was how many lives, both dead and living, would be affected by what I would uncover in the coming days. The locket was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a key that would unlock a mystery that had haunted these grounds for generations. Morning visits to cemeteries are different from nighttime investigations. The spirits are still present, but they're quieter, less insistent, like the difference between a shout and a whisper. I hadn't planned to return to Oakwood until evening, but the discovery of the locket changed everything. I needed to speak with someone who knew the cemetery's history, and I knew just who to find. Harold Matthews had been Oakwood's groundskeeper for over 40 years. I'd read about him during my research and knew he lived in a small cottage at the edge of the cemetery grounds. What I hadn't expected was for him to be waiting for me when I arrived shortly after sunrise. "Figured you'd be coming," he said by way of greeting. Harold was a tall, thin man with weather-beaten features and eyes that had seen too much. Word gets around when someone starts asking questions about Emily. I tried to hide my surprise. "You know about Emily?" He gestured toward a wooden bench near his cottage. "Sit. This isn't a short story, and these old legs aren't what they used to be." As we sat, Harold pulled out an ancient leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket. The pages were yellow with age, the binding held together with fraying twine. "This belonged to my grandfather," he explained. "He was groundskeeper here before my father, who was groundskeeper before me. 3 generations of Matthews men have watched over these graves." He opened the notebook carefully, its pages crackling with age. "You found Margaret Blackwood's grave last night," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," I admitted, "and something else." I reached into my bag and pulled out the locket, still wrapped in its handkerchief. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he looked at it. "So it's finally surfaced. We always knew it would eventually. The dead don't let their secrets stay buried forever." He turned to a specific page in the notebook and began to read. "April 15th, 1868. Another visit from the young lady in blue. She stands by Miss Blackwood's grave until dawn, though no one living comes to mourn. The master says to leave her be, but I fear her soul is troubled." "The lady in blue," I whispered, remembering the apparition I'd seen the night before. Harold nodded. "That's how my grandfather described her in all his entries. She appeared regularly for months after Margaret Blackwood's death. But here's where it gets interesting." He flipped forward several pages. "October 31st, 1868. The lady in blue came again, but this time she was not alone. A second figure stood with her, both weeping at the grave. When I approached, they vanished, leaving only the scent of roses." My mind raced, connecting dots. 2 figures, Margaret and Emily? "That's what we've always believed," Harold said. "But there's more to the story. Margaret Blackwood didn't die of natural causes. According to my grandfather's notes, she was found in the rose garden of her family's estate. No mark upon her except a single thorn prick on her finger. Some said it was an accident, others whispered of poison, but nothing was ever proven." I opened my notebook and began taking notes. "What about Emily? Was she a relative?" Harold's expression grew troubled. That's the strange part. There's no record of an Emily connected to the Blackwood family. We've searched through all the documents, all the family histories. It's as if she never existed. And yet, he gestured to the notebook. My grandfather wrote about seeing two distinct figures dozens of times. The lady in blue, whom we assume was Margaret's spirit, and another young woman who seemed to be searching for something. The locket, I suggested. Perhaps. Harold closed his notebook carefully. But here's something to consider. Why would a spirit spend over a century searching for a locket? There must be something more significant about it. I carefully unwrapped the locket, studying its tarnished surface in the morning light. The design was intricate, vines and flowers etched into the silver, though darkened with age. Have you ever seen it opened? Harold shook his head. It's never been found before, though many have looked. My grandfather wrote that the lady in blue would often appear to be clutching something at her throat, but whenever anyone approached, she'd vanish. Just then, my EMF meter, which had been silent in my bag, suddenly came to life with a series of sharp beeps. The temperature around us dropped noticeably, causing Harold to pull his jacket closer. "They're listening," he said quietly. "They always are. The dead are patient, but they're also persistent. They know when someone is finally ready to hear their story." The EMF meter's activity increased, and I felt that familiar pressure in my ears. But this time, instead of a voice or a vision, I smelled something. The sweet, unmistakable scent of roses in bloom, completely out of place on this chilly autumn morning. Harold noticed it too. Roses were Margaret's favorite, he said. The Blackwood estate was famous for its rose garden. Some say that's why she was there that fatal night, tending to her beloved flowers. I took out my digital recorder and set it on the bench between us. "Mr. Matthews, would you be willing to tell me everything you know about the Blackwoods? Every detail might be important." He nodded slowly. "I'll tell you what I know, but understand this. Some secrets in this cemetery are protected by both the living and the dead. The story of Margaret and Emily. It's not just about a death or a haunting. It's about a truth that someone very powerful wanted to keep hidden." As Harold began his tale, I noticed movement at the corner of my vision. Two figures standing near Margaret's grave in the distance. But when I turned to look directly at them, they were gone, leaving only a single white rose petal drifting on the morning breeze. The mystery was deepening, and I had a feeling that the locket in my hands was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to unlocking a story that had been waiting over a century to be told. A story of love, loss, and secrets that someone had killed to keep hidden. The rest of my conversation with Harold had to wait. As soon as he began to delve deeper into the Blackwood family history, the cemetery's atmosphere changed dramatically. The temperature dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the bench between us, and the EMF meter's activity became erratic. Someone, or something, didn't want certain stories told just yet. After Harold retreated to his cottage, I decided to focus my investigation on the oldest section of the cemetery. If I couldn't get answers about Margaret and Emily directly, perhaps I could piece together the social context of their era through the stories told by neighboring graves. The oldest section of Oakwood lay in the northwestern corner, where weathered headstones leaned at precarious angles, and ancient oak trees spread their protective branches over centuries-old graves. As I walked among these testament to lives long past, my digital recorder picked up something unusual. Fragments of what sounded like classical music, barely audible but distinct. "Mozart," I whispered, recognizing the piece. Piano Sonata No. 11 in a major, popular among the upper classes in the 1860s. I'd learned to pay attention to such details. Spirits often communicate through the cultural touchstones of their era. The music led me to an elaborate family plot, surrounded by an ornate iron fence. The gate's hinges protested as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the morning stillness. The plot belonged to the Henderson family, and according to the dates on the monuments, they had been prominent in the area during exactly the period I was interested in. As I examined the headstones, I noticed something curious. Among the formal Victorian-era epithets was a simple stone, smaller than the others, bearing only initials and a date, EH 1868, the same year as Margaret Blackwood's death. My hands trembled slightly as I cleared away decades of moss from the small stone. The EMF meter, which I'd set on a nearby monument, suddenly spiked, its lights flashing in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. "Are you trying to tell me something?" I asked aloud, directing my question to the silent graves around me. "Is this connected to Emily?" The response came not through my equipment, but through a sudden gust of wind that scattered leaves across the plot, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. A pattern in the way the smaller graves were arranged around the central monument. They formed a perfect circle, except for one gap, as if a stone was missing. I consulted the cemetery's old map that Harold had lent me. According to the records, there should have been another grave here, but the stone was gone, with only a shallow depression in the earth marking where it had been. As I knelt to examine the depression, my knee brushed against something hard in the grass. Brushing aside the overgrowth, I found a small metal box, about the size of a playing card deck, its surface green with verdigris. Unlike the locket, this felt like something I could examine immediately. The box's lid was stuck, but with gentle pressure, it finally opened. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a carefully folded piece of paper and what appeared to be a pressed rose, its petals dark with age but still intact. The paper proved to be a letter, the ink faded but still legible. My hands shook as I carefully unfolded it. "Dearest M, the arrangements are made. E has agreed to help us, though the risk to her position is great. When next the moon is full, meet me where the roses bloom at midnight. Bring the locket, it contains everything we need. Forever yours." The letter was dated October 15th, 1868, exactly 1 week before Margaret Blackwood's death. My mind raced with possibilities. The initials, the date, the mention of the locket, it couldn't be coincidence. But before I could process what I'd found, something extraordinary happened. The pressed rose in the box began to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow, and the air filled with that same sweet scent I'd noticed earlier. A figure appeared between the graves. Not the lady in blue this time, but a different woman, dressed in the severe black clothing of a Victorian-era servant or companion. She stood motionless, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand and pointed toward the cemetery's eastern boundary, where the ruins of what had once been a caretaker's chapel still stood. I quickly photographed the letter and box in situ, then carefully packed them away in evidence bags. As I did so, the spectral figure remained, still pointing, still waiting. Understanding that I was meant to follow, I gathered my equipment and stood. The ghost began to move toward the chapel ruins, her feet not quite touching the ground. I followed, my heart pounding with equal parts excitement and apprehension. In all my years as a medium, I'd never experienced such clear, purposeful guidance from a spirit. As we approached the chapel, the figure stopped and turned to face me. For a brief moment, her features became startlingly clear. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with a serious expression and eyes that held tremendous sadness. Then she spoke, her voice like rustling leaves. "Some secrets are kept in stone, others in flesh. Beware what you unlock." With that cryptic warning, she vanished, leaving me alone before the chapel's crumbling entrance. The ruins loomed before me, their shadows seeming to hold countless untold stories. And somewhere within those weathered walls, I suspected, lay another piece of the puzzle that connected Margaret Blackwood, the mysterious Emily, and a tragedy that had echoed through more than a century of silence. The chapel ruins would have to wait. As I stood there, contemplating my next move, a sound caught my attention, the clear, unmistakable laughter of a child. In a cemetery, particularly one as old as Oakwood, such sounds usually have tragic implications. I followed the ethereal laughter to a small section of the cemetery I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a grove of ancient yew trees. Here, the graves were different, smaller, decorated with weathered stone lambs and sleeping angels. This was the children's section, a common feature in Victorian-era cemeteries. Among these monuments to lives cut tragically short, one grave stood out. Unlike the others, it bore no cherubic decorations, no lambs, no angels. Instead, a simple marble headstone read, "Grace Beloved Child, 1868, just the year, the same year." that seemed to be at the center of everything in this investigation, and a first name. No last name, no dates of birth or death. In Victorian times, when genealogy and family connections were considered supremely important, such anonymity was highly unusual. As I approached the grave, my EMF meter began registering activity unlike anything I'd seen before. Instead of the usual erratic spikes, it produced a steady, rhythmic pattern like a child's skipping rope hitting the ground. The temperature around Grace's grave remained normal, unusual in itself, as spirit activity typically creates cold spots. Instead, I felt a gentle warmth, like sunshine on my face, though the day was overcast. "Hello, Grace," I said softly, kneeling beside the small grave. "I'm here to listen, if you'd like to talk." The response was immediate. My digital recorder, set on the grass beside me, began playing back a sound that hadn't been there when recorded. A music box melody I recognized as Lavender's Blue, a popular lullaby of the Victorian era. Then I saw her. Unlike the other spirits I'd encountered in Oakwood, Grace appeared not as a shadowy figure or a partial manifestation, but as a solid-looking child of about 6 years old, wearing a white pinafore over a blue dress. She sat on her own headstone, swinging her legs and regarding me with curious eyes. "You can see the lady in blue," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was perfectly clear, lacking the ethereal quality usually associated with spirit voices. "Yes," I replied, trying to maintain my professional composure, despite the extraordinary nature of this interaction. "Do you know her?" Grace nodded. "She comes to play with me sometimes, her and the other lady. They tell me stories about the roses." "The other lady? Is that Emily?" The child's expression grew serious. "I'm not supposed to talk about her. They said it's a secret." She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a whisper. "But I can show you something." She hopped down from the headstone and skipped, toward a nearby oak tree. Unlike adult spirits, child spirits often maintain the mannerisms and behaviors they had in life. I followed, noting that she left no footprints in the damp grass. At the base of the tree was a small hollow, partially hidden by exposed roots. Grace pointed to it. "Look inside. They used to leave me presents there." Kneeling, I shone my flashlight into the hollow. At first, I saw nothing but old leaves and dirt, but as I reached in, my fingers touched something solid, a small tin box, similar to what Victorian children might have used to hold treasures. The box was rusted but intact. Inside, I found several items: a small porcelain doll missing one arm, a handful of seashells, a ribbon faded to gray, and, most significantly, a folded piece of paper. Unlike the letter I'd found earlier, this paper was covered in a child's drawings. They showed 3 figures: a woman in a blue dress, another woman in dark clothing, and a small figure I assumed represented Grace herself. They were standing in what appeared to be a garden, surrounded by roses. On the back of the drawing, in an adult's careful handwriting, was written, "Keep this safe, little one. Remember what we discussed. E." "Emily gave me that," Grace said, her voice suddenly closer. "She said I had to hide it because bad people were looking for it. She said it was very important." "What happened to Emily?" I asked gently. Grace's form began to fade slightly. "I'm not supposed to say, but..." She glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, a terribly adult gesture from a child's spirit. "Look in the chapel, where the red stone is broken. That's where they hid the truth." Before I could ask what she meant, Grace vanished completely. The warmth that had surrounded her grave dissipated, replaced by the usual cemetery chill. But the evidence remained: the box, the drawing, and now a new clue about the chapel. I carefully photographed and documented everything before placing the items in evidence bags. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's grave held more significance than its simple appearance suggested. A child's grave with no family name from the exact year of Margaret's death, visited by both Margaret's spirit and the mysterious Emily. Standing up, I noticed something I'd missed before. From this angle, I could see that Grace's grave was positioned exactly halfway between Margaret Blackwood's grave and the Henderson family plot. In Victorian cemeteries, nothing was accidental. Every placement had meaning. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but it was still incomplete. Why would a child be connected to whatever tragedy had unfolded here in 1868? What secret was so important that spirits would spend over a century protecting it? As I walked back toward the chapel ruins, I heard Grace's laughter one more time, carried on the wind like distant wind chimes. The sound held both joy and sadness, much like the mystery itself, which seemed to deepen with every answer I uncovered. There are certain times when the veil between worlds grows thinner. Midnight, obviously, but particularly midnight during the dark of the moon. As I prepared to investigate the chapel ruins that evening, I was acutely aware that tonight was just such a night. The chapel had been abandoned since the 1920s, according to Harold's records. Its stone walls still stood, but the roof had long since collapsed, leaving only a skeletal framework of ancient timber beams against the night sky. Gothic arches framed empty windows like hollow eyes, and ivy had claimed much of the exterior. Grace's words echoed in my mind. Look in the chapel, where the red stone is broken. I'd spent the afternoon researching and discovered that the chapel had been partially constructed using a distinctive red sandstone imported from a local quarry that had closed in the 1850s. Finding a broken piece of that stone might be like looking for a needle in a haystack. I set up my equipment with methodical care: EMF meter, digital recorder, infrared camera, and several battery-powered LED lanterns. Experience had taught me that spirits often drain electronic equipment of power, so redundancy was essential. The locket and the two boxes we'd discovered, both the metal one from the Henderson plot and Grace's tin box, I placed carefully on a flat stone that had once been part of the altar. "I'm here to understand," I announced to the empty chapel. "I have your treasures, and I want to help tell your story." The response was immediate and dramatic. All of my lanterns flickered simultaneously, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath frosted in the air. The EMF meter's display went crazy, showing readings far beyond its normal range. Then I heard it. Voices. Multiple voices, whispering in what sounded like Latin. My digital recorder would later reveal them to be reciting what appeared to be a marriage ceremony, though parts of it were unlike any traditional Catholic or Anglican service I'd ever encountered. Movement caught my eye. A figure near the remains of the altar, wearing clerical robes. Unlike the other spirits I'd encountered in Oakwood, this one seemed unaware of my presence. He was performing a ceremony, his hands raised in blessing over an unseen congregation. The scene shifted, like double-exposed film, and suddenly I could see them all. Two women standing before the altar, their hands clasped together, while a small figure that could only be Grace scattered rose petals at their feet. The women's faces were unclear, but one wore a blue dress that I immediately recognized. "Margaret," I whispered, and the vision flickered like a candle in wind. The other woman turned slightly, and though her features remained indistinct, I caught a glimpse of something familiar. She wore a locket identical to the one I'd found, glinting in the spectral candlelight. The scene dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the ruined chapel. But something had changed. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. I moved my lantern slowly across the chapel floor, looking for any sign of red sandstone. Near the base of the northern wall, partially hidden by fallen debris, I found what I was looking for: a broken section of red stone flooring, the pieces arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. It took nearly an hour to carefully clear away the debris. Beneath the broken stones was a small cavity, and within it, wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth, was a book. The book was small, bound in leather that had gone brittle with age. Its pages contained handwritten entries, a diary. The first entry was dated January 15, 1868. "Today I begin this record of truth, though I pray it never needs to be read. What we plan is dangerous but necessary. Love demands courage, and we have found ours at last. If you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong." The next several entries were water-damaged and illegible, but a passage from October caught my eye. "The ceremony is arranged. Father James has agreed to help us, though it puts his position at risk. The locket contains the proof we need, should questions ever arise. Margaret insists we include Grace in our plans. The child has become dear to us both, and her presence will make everything appear more innocent to prying eyes." My hands trembled as I read. This was Emily's diary. It had to be. But before I could read more, a powerful gust of wind swept through the chapel, scattering my papers and extinguishing all but one lantern. In the resulting darkness, I saw them clearly for the first time. Margaret and Emily standing hand in hand before me. Their faces were filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Margaret reached out, her spectral hand passing through the diary in my hands. "Tell our story," Emily's voice whispered, clear as crystal in the darkness. "But be careful. Those who silenced us once would do so again." "Who?" I asked, but they were already fading. "Who silenced you?" The only answer was a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of breaking stone. My remaining lantern illuminated a fresh break in the chapel wall, revealing a space behind the stones. Inside was something that made my blood run cold. A stack of letters, bound with a black ribbon, and atop them a newspaper clipping from 1868 with the headline, "Tragic Accident Claims 3 at Blackwood Estate." Dawn was approaching by the time I finished documenting everything from the chapel. The stack of letters and newspaper clipping required careful handling. Paper from the 1860s is incredibly fragile. I photographed everything in situ before gently placing the items in archival quality preservation sleeves. The newspaper article was from the local Gazette, dated October 23, 1868. I read it carefully in the growing morning light. "Tragic accident claims 3 at Blackwood Estate." A terrible accident at the renowned Blackwood Estate has claimed 3 lives. Miss Margaret Blackwood, daughter of prominent businessman Gerald Blackwood, was found deceased in the estate's rose garden alongside her companion, Miss Emily Henderson, and a young ward of the family. Initial reports suggest the deaths were caused by accidental poison exposure from newly acquired tropical plant specimens in the garden. Mr. Blackwood declined to comment, but sources close to the family indicate the specimens have since been destroyed. The article continued with flowery Victorian-era platitudes about the family's standing in society, but what caught my attention were the deliberate omissions. The young ward wasn't named, but it had to be Grace. And Emily's identity was finally confirmed. She was Emily Henderson, presumably connected to the Henderson family plot I'd discovered earlier. I spread out the letters carefully. They were correspondence between Emily and Margaret, spanning several months in 1868. The content was carefully coded, but certain patterns emerged. They referred to each other by initials, discussed arrangements and plans, and frequently mentioned Grace. One letter in particular stood out. "Dearest M, the arrangements with Father James are complete. He understands our situation and agrees that love must triumph over society's narrow views." Grace is excited about her role in the ceremony. She practices scattering rose petals daily. "Your father's threats do not frighten me. We have taken precautions, as you know. The locket contains everything needed to prove our case should it come to that. Once the ceremony is complete, we can leave for the continent. I have friends in Paris who will welcome us without question. All my love, E." The letter was dated October 20th, 1868, just 3 days before the accident. A noise behind me made me jump. It was Harold, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me a cup. "Been watching you work all night from my cottage window. Found something important?" I showed him the newspaper clipping and explained what I'd discovered. His weathered face grew increasingly grave as he listened. "There's something you need to see," he said finally. "Been debating whether to show you, but after this." He pulled out his grandfather's notebook again and turned to a page near the back. "This is my grandfather's account of what really happened that night." The entry was brief but chilling. October 23rd, 1868. What they printed in the paper was lies. I heard the shots myself. 3 shots in the rose garden at midnight. When I got there, it was too late. Mr. Blackwood stood over them, the pistol still smoking. He saw me, but said nothing. The next day, men came and cleared out the garden. They planted new specimens, tropical plants from South America, known to be poisonous. I kept quiet to protect my family, but I write this so the truth won't die with me. "There's more," Harold said quietly. "Look at this." He led me to the Blackwood family plot, a grand affair with an imposing central monument. On the monument's base was a list of family members. Gerald Blackwood's death date was October 24th, 1868, the day after the accident. "Found dead in his study," Harold explained. "Official verdict was heart failure, but he couldn't live with what he'd done, I finished. A cold breeze rustled the leaves around us, and my EMF meter chirped to life. The scent of roses filled the air, stronger than ever. "They've been waiting for someone to uncover the truth," Harold said. "But be careful, the Blackwood family is still powerful in this town. There are those who'd prefer these secrets stay buried." As if in response to his words, we heard the distinct sound of footsteps on gravel, too solid to be spectral. Someone was coming through the cemetery gates, heading our way with purpose. "Looks like we're about to meet some resistance," Harold muttered. The approaching figure was dressed in an expensive suit, carrying what looked like legal documents. The resemblance to the portrait of Gerald Blackwood on the family monument was unmistakable. This had to be a descendant. The modern-day Blackwood stopped a few feet away, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. "I understand you've been investigating certain historical matters," he said coldly. "I should inform you that you're at risk of violating several heritage preservation laws. The family has filed for an injunction." But before he could finish, something extraordinary happened. The temperature dropped dramatically, and 3 distinct figures appeared behind us: Margaret, Emily, and Grace, all clearly visible in the morning light. The Blackwood heir stumbled backward, his face draining of color. The spirits didn't speak or move. They simply stood together, their message clear. The truth would not be silenced this time. The autumn equinox has always been a powerful time for spirit communication. The balance between light and dark creates perfect conditions for crossing the veil, and this particular equinox would prove to be the most extraordinary night of my investigation. The confrontation with the modern-day Blackwood heir had ended in an uneasy stalemate. While his legal threats carried weight, the sudden appearance of 3 distinct spirits in broad daylight had shaken him profoundly. He'd retreated, but I knew this wouldn't be the end of the family's interference. I arrived at Oakwood just before sunset on the equinox. Harold met me at the gates, carrying an old leather satchel. "Found these in the cottage attic," he said, pulling out a stack of yellowed photographs. "They're from the 1860s, garden parties at the Blackwood estate. Thought they might help." The photographs were remarkable, formal Victorian compositions showing the estate's famous rose garden in its prime. In one image, I spotted Margaret standing next to a rose trellis, and slightly behind her, partially turned away from the camera, was a woman who had to be Emily Henderson. But it was another photo that caught my attention, a group shot of the household staff. Among them was a figure I recognized: the severe-looking woman in black who had led me to the chapel. The photo's caption identified her as Miss Sarah Winters, head housekeeper. "Sarah Winters," I murmured. "She was there the night they died. She must have witnessed everything." "And she's buried here," Harold added, "staff section near the east wall." As the sun set, we made our way to Sarah Winters' grave. It was a modest stone but well-maintained. Someone had recently left fresh flowers, white roses. "Hello, Sarah," I said quietly. "We know you saw what happened. We know you've been trying to help us uncover the truth." The response was immediate. Our EMF meters simultaneously registered massive spikes, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the stone. Then, in my digital recorder, a clear voice emerged. The master was a proud man. When he discovered their plan, his rage was terrible to behold. Sarah's spirit materialized before us, more solid-looking than I'd ever seen a spirit appear. The equinox energy was making this possible, a direct, clear communication. "They only wanted to be together," Sarah continued. "Miss Margaret and Miss Emily had fallen in love, but such things weren't permitted then. They planned to escape to Paris after the ceremony. Little Grace was to go with them. She was Emily's niece, you see, orphaned and secretly placed in the household by Emily to be close to her." The pieces were finally fitting together. Grace's mysterious presence, the secret ceremony, the locket's importance, it was all part of their escape plan. "The locket," Sarah's spirit said, gesturing toward my bag where I kept it. "It contains their testament, a declaration of their love and commitment, signed and witnessed by Father James. They thought it would protect them, give them legal standing in Paris. But the master—" Her form flickered, the energy required for such clear communication clearly draining her. "Mr. Blackwood followed them to the garden that night," she continued quickly. I tried to warn them, but I was too late. He shot Miss Emily first, then Grace as she ran to her aunt's body. Miss Margaret. She picked up a rose and pricked her finger on its thorn. "You can't stop us, Father," she said. The thorn was poisoned. She'd planned it as a last resort. She died in the garden she loved, defying him to the end. Suddenly, the air around us began to shimmer. The equinox energy was creating something I'd never seen before. A temporal window, allowing us to witness echoes of the past. The rose garden materialized around us, spectral but distinct. We saw it all. Margaret and Emily's secret meetings in the garden, Grace scattering rose petals during their private ceremony, Father James blessing their union, and finally, the terrible night of their deaths. Gerald Blackwood's face was contorted with rage as he discovered them preparing to flee, his pistol gleaming in the moonlight. But we also saw something else. Sarah hiding behind a trellis, witnessing everything. After the deaths, she retrieved the locket from Margaret's body and hid it, ensuring the truth would be preserved. "The master saw me that night," Sarah's voice continued. "He knew I knew everything. The next day he called me to his study. But before he could silence me too, his guilt overcame him. I found him at his desk, an empty poison vial beside him. The visions faded, leaving us in the dark cemetery, but Sarah's spirit remained. I've waited over a century for someone to uncover the truth," she said. "The Blackwood family buried it all, changed the records, planted the poisonous plants, even had Father James transferred to a remote parish. But they couldn't bury our memories." As she spoke, other spirits began to appear around us. The household staff, groundskeepers, and servants who had kept this secret for generations. Among them stood Father James, still wearing his clerical robes, holding what appeared to be a marriage certificate. "The ceremony was real," he said softly. "In God's eyes, their love was blessed, no matter what society thought." The equinox energy was fading, and with it the spirits began to dim. But before they vanished, Sarah's voice came one last time. "In the rose garden, beneath the oldest trellis, you'll find the proof, my written testimony, buried in a jar. The modern Blackwoods know it exists, but they've never found it. That's why they're frightened now. The truth can finally come out." The day after the equinox revelations, I received a cease and desist letter from the Blackwood family's lawyers. They cited heritage preservation laws, trespassing concerns, and potential defamation. But they couldn't stop what was already in motion. The dead had waited too long to be silenced again. Harold and I met at his cottage early that morning to review our evidence. The photographs, letters, diary entries, and most importantly, the locket, were carefully laid out on his kitchen table. But it was my digital recordings from the equinox that proved most compelling. "Listen to this," I said, playing back one of the clearer EVP sessions. Sarah Winter's voice came through with remarkable clarity. "Master Blackwood changed the parish records. Look for the original church registry in Father James's personal effects. He made a copy before they forced him to alter the official version." Another voice, which we now knew to be Father James, added, "Box marked personal papers, 1868, in the diocesan archives. The truth is there, waiting." As we listened, the cottage's temperature suddenly dropped. My EMF meter, sitting among our evidence, began to flash. The scent of roses filled the small room, and a new voice emerged from my recorder, one we hadn't captured during the equinox. "Gerald's study," Margaret's voice whispered. "Behind the painting of the rose garden. He hid his confession there." I looked at Harold. "The Blackwood estate is now a museum," he finished, "open to the public 3 days a week." Before we could discuss this further, we heard a car pulling up outside. Through the window, I saw the Blackwood heir returning, this time accompanied by several official-looking individuals. "Miss Winters prepared for this too," Harold said quickly, pulling an old envelope from his grandfather's notebook. Inside was a document dated October 25, 1868, a sworn statement describing the events in the rose garden, signed by Sarah Winters and witnessed by Harold's grandfather. "She knew they'd try to stop the truth from coming out," Harold explained. "Made copies, hid them in different places. My grandfather protected this one." The pounding on the cottage door began as we hurriedly gathered our evidence. But something extraordinary happened before they could enter. Every piece of electronic equipment we had suddenly activated simultaneously. EMF meters flashed, recorders played static, and my camera began taking photos on its own. In the resulting chaos of light and sound, 3 distinct voices came through every device at once. Margaret, we stand with you. Emily, the truth must be told. Grace, don't be afraid. The door burst open, revealing the Blackwood heir and his entourage, but they stopped short at the threshold, staring in shock at the supernatural display before them. Papers were floating in the air, suspended by an unseen force. The scent of roses was overwhelming. And there, clearly visible in the morning light, stood Sarah Winters. Her spectral form placed herself between us and the intruders, her expression fierce and protective. "They killed us for love," her voice rang out, audible to everyone present. "Your family buried the truth with our bodies, but truth, like love, cannot stay buried forever." The Blackwood heir's face had gone pale. One of his companions, a woman who appeared to be another family member, stepped forward, her expression different from the others. There were tears in her eyes. "I knew," she said quietly. "I found letters in my grandmother's attic. She was ashamed of what her father, Gerald, had done. She wanted to make it right, but didn't know how." The supernatural activity gradually subsided, but the impact of the moment remained. Sarah's spirit faded, but not before giving us one final message. "The rose garden. Go now while they're here. The proof is waiting." I looked at the Blackwood family members, seeing the conflict on their faces. Generations of secrets were unraveling, and they had a choice to make: continue the cover-up or help bring healing to both the living and the dead. The woman who had spoken stepped fully into the cottage. "I'll help you," she said. "It's time. The rose garden is part of the museum tours now, but I have a key. We can go right now." As we prepared to leave for the Blackwood estate, I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder, a familiar sensation by now. Looking back, I saw them one more time. Margaret, Emily, and Grace, standing together, finally at peace with their story being told. The truth that had been buried in 1868 was about to see the light of day, and not even the combined power of the modern Blackwood family could stop it now. The Blackwood estate stood as a testament to Victorian grandeur, 3 stories of imposing architecture surrounded by carefully maintained grounds. But it was the rose garden that drew our attention. Though modernized over the years, the basic layout remained unchanged since 1868. Catherine Blackwood, the family member who had chosen to help us, led our small group through the garden's iron gates. Having grown up hearing whispered fragments of the family scandal, she had spent years piecing together her own version of events. "Grandmother used to come here every October 23rd, she explained, walking toward an ancient rose trellis. She would place 3 white roses by the old sundial and cry. When I asked why, she would only say, 'For love, child, for love that should have lived.'" The sundial stood at the garden's center, its base thick with decades of climbing roses. According to Sarah Winters' spirit, her testimony was buried nearby, preserved in a jar. But as we approached, my equipment began registering unusual activity. "Something's different," I said, watching the EMF meter's erratic display. "The energy here, it's not just residual." Harold consulted his grandfather's notebook. The original garden had a feature that's not on the modern plans, a small reflection pool, right where the sundial stands now. Catherine nodded. "It was filled in during the 1920s renovation. The sundial was placed on top." As if responding to our conversation, a sharp crack echoed through the garden. A hairline fracture appeared in the sundial's base, spreading like a spider's web through the ancient stone. "Stand back," Harold warned, but before anyone could move, the ground beneath the sundial shifted. The entire structure tilted slightly, revealing a dark space underneath. The scent of roses intensified, and my digital recorder captured a chorus of whispers. "Here. Look here. The truth lies here." Using modern archaeological techniques to preserve any evidence, we carefully excavated around the sundial's base. About 2 feet down, we found it. Not just Sarah's testified jar, but something far more significant. A small coffin, made of lead and sealed against time, lay beneath the stones. The size made its purpose clear. It had held Grace's remains before they were moved to the cemetery. The official records show all 3 victims were buried at Oakwood immediately, Catherine said, her voice shaking. But, according to my grandmother's diary, Grace's body disappeared for several days after the shooting. The family claimed it was being prepared for burial. The lead coffin contained no remains. Those truly did rest at Oakwood now. But it held something else, a waterproof leather satchel filled with documents. Among them, we found the original marriage certificate signed by Father James, declaring the union of Margaret Blackwood and Emily Henderson, letters between Margaret and Emily discussing their plans to create a life together in Paris, legal documents preparing to make Grace their legal ward, a detailed confession written by Gerald Blackwood himself, penned the night of his suicide. The confession was particularly chilling. What I did to preserve the family name. But I see their faces when I close my eyes, my daughter's final look of defiance, Emily's attempt to shield Grace, the child's terror. I cannot live with this truth, yet I cannot die without recording it. Let God judge me as he will. M&E Together in Love, 1868, witnessed by Grace. Below these words, barely visible, was a small handprint pressed into the once wet cement, a child's hand, Grace's final mark on the world. Catherine touched the handprint gently, tears flowing freely now. "All these years," she whispered, "all these years of shame and secrets, when we should have been honoring their love and courage." The discovery at the Blackwood estate would change everything. Not just about how history viewed the events of 1868, but about how the modern world would understand love that refused to be denied. The proof we found that day would help heal wounds that had festered for over a century. But as I watched the spirit slowly fade into the gathering darkness, I realized that the greatest testament to Margaret and Emily's love wasn't in the documents or carvings we'd discovered. It was in the fact that their story had survived at all, preserved by those who believed that love deserves to be remembered. The first time I saw them dancing, it was a moonless night. The cemetery was unnaturally quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. My lantern flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the wavering silhouettes of oak trees swaying in a non-existent breeze. But then I realized the shadows weren't just moving, they were interacting. They swirled and twisted together, forming what looked like two figures locked in a slow, mournful waltz. I stood frozen, the lantern trembling in my grip. The EMF meter in my pocket began to beep softly, the sound rising and falling in rhythm with the movement of the shadows. It wasn't until I stepped closer that I saw them clearly. Margaret and Emily, their forms faint but unmistakable, moving in perfect harmony. The air around them shimmered like heat waves, and as I watched, a hauntingly beautiful melody filled the air. It wasn't coming from my equipment, nor was it something I'd heard before. It was soft, ethereal, and utterly captivating. "You're still here," I whispered, not expecting a response. But Margaret turned her head toward me, her translucent face alight with an expression of deep sadness and longing. "They won't let us go," Emily's voice echoed, faint and distant. "Not yet." "Who?" I asked, but the melody grew louder, drowning out my voice. The figures dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of grief that settled heavily in my chest. The dance was not just a memory, but a reenactment of something unresolved, something that tethered them to this place. It was then I realized the answers I sought would not come from mere observation. I needed to engage with the spirits directly, to draw them out of their loops and into dialogue. Margaret and Emily had a story to tell, but I would need to earn their trust to hear it fully. The following night, I decided to visit the oldest section of the cemetery. Harold had mentioned a guardian spirit that many locals believed watched over Oakwood. Stories ranged from sightings of a towering, shadowy figure to the sound of heavy footsteps following visitors. While I'd encountered many spirits during my time here, this one seemed different, less a lingering soul and more a force of nature. "It's not a ghost in the traditional sense," Harold had warned me earlier. "It's something tied to the land itself, something ancient. Treat it with respect." As I approached the oldest graves, I felt the air change. It wasn't a temperature drop like most spirit encounters, but a weight, an almost oppressive sense of being watched. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a natural canopy. "I'm here to help," I said aloud, hoping to project calm and sincerity. I've come to listen. The response was immediate. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. My EMF meter spiked, its lights flickering erratically. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The figure was enormous, standing at least 7 feet tall, its form indistinct and ever-shifting. It seemed to be made of shadows and light, a constant interplay of presence and absence. Despite its imposing size, it didn't feel threatening. If anything, it exuded a sense of solemn authority. "Why are you here?" A deep, resonant voice echoed in my mind rather than my ears. "To uncover the truth," I replied, gripping my notebook tightly, "to help the spirits here find peace." The figure seemed to consider my words. "The truth is a heavy burden," it said. "Many have sought it, but few are prepared for its cost. Are you?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Then you must tread carefully," it warned. "There are those who would see the truth remain buried. Protect yourself, medium, for the living are often more dangerous than the dead." Before I could ask more, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. I felt both reassured and unnerved. Whatever this guardian spirit was, it had given me its blessing and its warning. The diary, the locket, and Sarah Winter's testimony had provided pieces of the puzzle, but something still felt missing. Margaret and Emily's story was incomplete, and the spirits themselves seemed hesitant to reveal the final chapter. I decided to revisit the Henderson family plot, hoping to find more clues. The small grave marked EH still felt significant, though I hadn't yet discovered its full connection to Emily. As I knelt by the grave, the air grew cold, and a voice whispered behind me. "You're so close," it said. Turning, I saw Sarah Winter's spirit standing by the iron fence. "What am I missing?" I asked her. "The betrayal," she replied, her voice heavy with emotion. "Emily trusted too easily. She believed love could protect her. But love alone is not always enough." Her form flickered, and she gestured toward the grave. Emily's family was complicit. They feared scandal more than they valued her happiness. The locket was meant to protect them, but it also sealed their fate. I suddenly understood. The Henderson family had played a role in covering up the tragedy, likely under pressure from the Blackwoods. Emily had been betrayed not just by society, but by those she thought she could trust. "How can I help?" I asked. Sarah's eyes met mine, her expression filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "Finish what we couldn't. Bring their story to light. Only then can we rest." As the weeks passed, I delved deeper into the archives, uncovering more about the Blackwoods and Hendersons. The truth was both more tragic and more sinister than I'd imagined. The marriage certificate hidden in the locket was legally binding, meaning Margaret and Emily's union was valid even by Victorian standards. The Blackwoods' actions had been motivated not just by prejudice, but by greed. Margaret's inheritance would have passed to Emily, disrupting the family's financial plans. One night, as I pored over the documents in my small office, I felt a presence. Looking up, I saw Margaret and Emily standing together, their forms more solid than ever before. They radiated a calm determination. "It's time," Margaret said. "Time for what?" I asked. Emily stepped forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "To walk with us, to see what we saw. Only then can you tell our story truthfully." Before I could respond, the room darkened, and I felt myself being pulled into a vision. I was no longer in my office, but in the rose garden on that fateful night. I saw it all unfold, the ceremony, the confrontation, the tragedy. But I also saw moments of love and defiance, of courage in the face of unimaginable odds. When the vision ended, I was back in my office, tears streaming down my face. Margaret and Emily were gone, but their presence lingered. They had given me everything I needed to finish their story. The book was published 6 months later. Unbroken, the love story of Margaret and Emily quickly gained attention, both for its historical significance and its emotional depth. The Blackwood family's attempts to suppress the story failed, and the truth finally came to light. Oakwood Cemetery became a place of pilgrimage, not for ghost hunters, but for those inspired by Margaret and Emily's love and resilience. The rose garden was restored to its former glory, with a plaque dedicated to their memory. One evening as I walked among the graves, I felt the familiar chill of spirit activity. Turning, I saw them one last time. Margaret and Emily stood hand in hand, their faces serene. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice like a gentle breeze. "You gave us our peace, Emily added. As they faded into the twilight, I felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Their story had been told, their love remembered. And in that moment, I knew that Oakwood Cemetery, once a place of sorrow, had finally become a place of peace.